Loblaw is hoping to make amends for its price-fixing scandal as registration for those $25 vouchers opens up today for anyone affected by the 14-year scheme. For perspective on this move and whether it will be enough to win back some goodwill with customers, we're joined by Richard LeBlanc, professor of corporate governance at York University. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you, John.
Okay, from the corporate governance side of this, what's been your perspective on this story?
Well, Loblaws came forward and said we're guilty, and by doing that, they got immunity. They had to cooperate and they had to reveal all evidence, and now the burden shifts to its competitors. So it was a gesture of goodwill to come forward with the gift cards. They are also being sued by 3 law firms seeking $1.1 billion. And Loblaws will argue that we're on the road to making it right. We've admitted guilt, and we're going to give gift cards to consumers. Whether that's enough, the lawyers will argue that it's not. And
the complication of using this card, we had Jameson Burko on earlier talking about what exactly you are legally agreeing to by taking one of these cards. Is there a past example that seems similar to you for how a company deals with an issue like something like this?
No, this is unique, and it's very clever by Loblaws because they're not saying that you're giving up your rights. There's a 5-page agreement that came out yesterday that is, the fine print, but Loblaws has said that any incremental obligation that we have, we will pay into a fund. So what I predict what Loblaws is going to do is create a database of several hundred customers and go back to the law firm and say your quantification of damages is excessive, and we're dealing with this, and by, in a sense, carving out the law firms and remedying directly to customers over a 14-year period. Now, the lawyers will argue that $25 is inadequate, and in fact, it could be for a family of 4 over a 15-year period. It could be several $100s. So we're going to have a dispute among Loblaws and the lawyers. But aside from the legal aspect of it, the PR aspect is very clever because they've come out, they've admitted guilt, they've implemented significant corporate governance reforms. They've got compliance now reporting right into the Loblaws boardroom. They've got training for marketing and sales personnel in what could constitute price fixing. And everybody's talking about gift cards, and you can get your gift card fairly readily if you've shopped and you've bought bread, and most of us have, and you don't have to really go through a public class action lawsuit and have it delayed for several years.
And I wonder if this is any different than a situation where a company deals with a specific instance where people were significantly harmed, maybe bodily harm, for example, or injuries. You think about automakers or tire makers dealing with lawsuits from something going wrong with a vehicle. In this case, we're talking about the price of bread over a period of year. Mm-hmm. I don't know how many people go home and necessarily think too much about how wronged they were by this incident. Is there a difference when we're talking about everybody marginally impacted as opposed to a group that is substantially impacted?
Yeah, the difference here is that we're dealing with about a lot of people with a small amount of harm that is monetarily quantifiable, not human harm with a very narrow class of people. So what's new and clever about this is you're going right to the consumer and you're saying, listen, we're going to make this right from the company's point of view as opposed to having to go through the lawyers.
You mentioned that the competition was also brought into this by Loblaw, and as you know, one of their big rivals was not happy.
That's right.
By that. Michael Medline is the relatively new CEO of Empire, the parent company of Sobeys, who the letter got shared that he sent to the company saying, what are you doing? We haven't found any evidence of being tied into this story, and here you are damaging our brand. You're going to pay for that.
Well, they might cross-claim, but it takes people to agree tacitly to fix prices. So if one person is a whistleblower, which is in this case is Loblaws, they probably have some pretty good evidence that in fact there was some sort of collusion, and it's very difficult to prove. So the Competition Bureau incents people to come forward and says, come forward, almost like Mueller and Michael Flynn, come forward and flip, if you will, and then we will prosecute your competitors. So it was a clever move, not clever, but I think it was a sincere move by Galen Weston. This is not permitted in in our company, and we're going to make it right. It reminds me of Maple Leaf a number of years ago with the meat scare, coming clean right from the get-go.
Well, it's a reminder of how important that relationship is between the consumer and the company when we're talking about things like food, the people who are going there, interacting with all of your produce on a weekly basis.
That's right.
It's a very emotional relationship.
Yep.
And
like Tim Hortons last week.
Sure.
Right? Coming and preserving your brand and saying, even going so far as to say there are rogue franchisors that are putting minimum wage on the back of employees. We are going to make it right. So people protect their brand now. It's very, in the interconnected world, it's really important.
The flip side is, you've got a president like Trump who seems to say what he thinks and feels on the fly. Mm-hmm. Maybe avoids listening to the lawyers some of the time, maybe a lot of the time. This still feels like a very lawyered story. Just to be clear, we've reached out to the company many times to have an interview with Galen Weston.
Right.
He's not available. They're sticking to their party line and they're sticking to this playbook. In terms of the best course of action for a company when they're dealing with things like this and talking about it in the boardroom, what does history tell us about the right tone and approach?
The tone and approach now is exactly what Loblaw is doing. Not Trump, which is say anything, spur of the moment, and not going dark, but picking that middle spot where you're deliberative, you're making it right, you're coming out. The worst thing companies can do now is not respond and not make things right. So I think Loblaw is taking the best course of action. It's deliberative, it's guarded, but it's still very authentic and sincere.
And I talked to Jameson Burke about this earlier, but in terms of look, they've got to be speaking behind the scenes of, we want to resolve this issue so we can move on.
Right.
What kind of time frame do you think this stays in the headlines, given the playbook they've selected, if things play out the way that they want?
I think their brand will fully recover. I think they've done the right thing. This is a very serious issue. It's 14 years in prison. People have been sentenced to prison before for this exact same violation. I think their competitors are worried. Fines are up to $25 million. So I think Loblaw's did the right thing. And by doing so, it caught its competitors flat-footed, and now they're scrambling. So we'll see what happens. But I think the right thing was done.
Good perspective as always. Thanks, Richard.
My pleasure, John.
Richard LeBlanc, corporate governance professor at York University, joining us here in studio.